So I'm Tom Hagemans, co-founder and research lead of DIGITA indeed. And DIGITA is a company with a sole focus on solid. Just like Ben de Meester was just explaining, we're working on the same technology. Currently, we have several customers, such as banks and governments, and we employ a team of 10 people. In this presentation, I will present you the research that we've done around a question that our customers kept on asking. What about the GDPR? Well, the idea of this research was to use data sharing patterns as a tool to tackle legal considerations in the solid ecosystem. Keep in mind that you can access the full research report on our resources pages as well. So one of the most important use cases of Solid is data reuse. On this slide, you can see an example of how this looks like from the perspective of a user. So here you as a citizen can reuse your data from the government to easily apply for a life insurance at your bank. But to start, we noticed that data reuse within Solid is different from what we are used to. So first of all, when data is reused with Solid, the receiving party might get continuous access to the original copy of the data. Second, with Solid, it's possible to ensure the authenticity of the data, even when it is copied. And third, a person could reuse his or her data in many different contexts. That means that the involved parties might function in different capacity. For example, the data transfer could be between a government and a private organization or between two private organizations. But sadly, these observations make it hard to apply the current privacy legislation in a straightforward way. So that is why Dirk, a colleague of mine, and I came up with several research goals. So first, we had to look for patterns that summarize many of the ways in how data can be reused in a solid ecosystem. Next, we had to investigate how these patterns influence the user experience. And finally, we had to create a framework to determine which pattern was best suited based on legal considerations. So let me show you what we found. So on this slide, you can see the three patterns that describe how data from one party can be reused at another party. The first pattern describes a situation where the recipient of the data can get a direct and continuous access to the original copy of the data. The second pattern describes a situation where the recipient of the data gets access to a copy of the data that is stored at the person, him or herself. The third pattern describes a situation where the recipient of the data gets access to the data, but without asking a person for consent or permission. In the second part of the research, we have investigated how these patterns could impact the user experience. Without wanting to be exhaustive, we have listed several components that we see returning when we would actually implement the patterns. For each component, we have come up with several possible journeys and listed their advantages and disadvantages. So on this slide, you can see an example of one possible user journey for the first pattern. This user journey is particularly interesting because it makes sure that a user should not have to select his or her path, because this responsibility is delegated to a software artifact that's called a data browser. In the third part of the study, we created a framework to determine which pattern should be applied, taking into account legal considerations in Belgium. The framework is based upon several considerations, and these considerations can be used to determine how data is processed from a legal perspective. Afterwards, we have listed how these considerations should be applied to a different context. And this was necessary because there are different regulations for when a person reuses his or her data from a private company at a government, from a government to a government, from a private company to a private company, or a government to a private company. So finally, to make sure that the results of this research would be applicable in practice, we constructed a decision table per context to aid legal experts in picking the right pattern. So in conclusion, in this research, we constructed patterns that summarize how data can be reused within Solid, investigated the impact of these patterns on the user experience, and created a framework to determine which pattern is suited based on legal considerations. If you want to dive into the nitty-gritty details, you can simply browse to digita.ai/resources and download the report for free. Thank you very much for your attention.